In the previous mini lecture, we talked about different types of governments, such as authoritarian regimes, monarchies, and illiberal democracies. And when we started to talk about what is freedom, which is at the foundation of a democracy. Um, this mini lecture will focus specifically on democratic regimes, direct and indirect democracy, and let's take it from here. If you look behind me, the reason I chose this background picture is because the thing that's most associated with a democracy for many of us is the right to vote and our ability to participate in the political process. And while this is true, that this is a hallmark of democracy, we also have to be careful because just voting is probably not enough. And as we saw, there are a lot of illiberal democracies that use elections and voting, not free and fair elections, but just holding an election as kind of a way to save face. And despite the fact that they are non-democratic, to try and look a little bit more like it. If we look on the meaning of the word democracy, then the idea is that more people, obviously those who are eligible, have more power. So that is one of the hallmark of any democracy. And I want you to pause, try to kind of clear your head from everything you ever uh, learned about democracy and government and ask yourself, is that a good idea? This idea that more people in a given society will have more power. Is that a good idea? And you may or may not answer in the affirmative for this one. And the reason it's not is that has to do with this point of who is eligible, who is part of the group of more people, right? Because sometimes we can think about saying, yeah, I want people in my country to have a voice unless they are criminals or unless they are illegal immigrants or um, unless they didn't finish high school. So there's many different ways of why and how people try to constrain and narrow down who is the more people here. But in a free liberal democracy, we try to have as much inclusivity as possible. And so in most countries, most liberal democratic countries, we do have an age limit, the one where we start to think about a person as an adult. And it is set mostly to 18 years old. So anybody who's 18 and over can start fully participating and taking part in the political process, meaning to vote, run to office, etc. But even when you're younger, you can do other things. You can get information, you can get knowledgeable, you can participate in a protest, you can volunteer in a campaign, etc., etc. Democracy is a word and a practice that dates back to ancient Greece. And in Greek, demos means the citizens, in that case of a city-state, and kratos means power or rule. And this is why we say that democracy is the rule of the people or power to the people. Now, by people, we have to be careful because the model here is Athens. And Athens at the time was a city-state with a population of around 300,000 people. So much smaller than most countries almost every country that is a democracy today. So arguably, it's easier to run a democracy with less people. But we also have India, the largest democracy in the world, with 1.4 billion people living in it. And so when we are talking about this kind of number and we're giving more people more power, it looks very different than a population of 300,000 people. Another thing that is different is that if you look at that, demos in this context doesn't mean people, actually, it means citizens. And who are the citizens? In Athens of the time, those were free men. So non-slave, landowner, only male. And about 2/3 of the population of the 300,000 people were slaves. Then there are female, then there are people who are too young, then there are those who may not be slaves but are not landowners. And so we end up with a much smaller number of people involved in this democratic process. And still, even then in Athens, with a smaller number of people, they didn't really do direct democracy. They did some form of indirect representation. And we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes. Now, the idea of direct democracy is something that people always say, if we just give the people the power, the people know what's good, and they can vote. And we don't have a direct democracy. We have indirect democracy. We have representative democracy. But because of that, a lot of the wishes, wills, and wants, and a lot of the points of view are being lost. And that argument tries, or following that argument, there are movements and initiatives and ideas trying to utilize and use direct democracy in some ways even today. So we do see direct democracy examples in about 50 countries around the world, and in about more than a half of US states. We can think, when we are thinking about direct democracy today, we can think about initiatives. Initiatives are those ideas for specific policy or a specific law. If you have an idea that would address a specific issue or specific problem and you bring it forward, then that is called an initiative. Now, in most countries and in US states where initiatives are allowed, there is a threshold, and the threshold is usually how many people, how many other tier citizens you have to get to agree with you before you can put it up for a vote of the general citizenry. And they are specific thresholds that are specified in by laws, but that means that you need money because you need to campaign. You need to you need to educate people, and you need to try and get them to vote one way or another. And so you need to collect those signatories, people who say, yeah, I think it's a good idea that we will vote on it. And that's a campaign in and of its own. And so that's why a lot of times we see initiatives that are brought up by groups that have the resources. Now, an initiative is probably the most direct form of democracy. And what happens here is that if the initiative passes, then it becomes law. And because of that, we see initiatives about diverse issues recently, and we'll look at some examples in a couple of minutes. But the legalization of the use of what's now considered illegal drugs, such as pot and others, that is an example that usually that gets to the ballot through initiative. A group of citizens who write a proposal for the law, get enough people to support them, put it on the ballot, and then people vote on it, it passes, and then it becomes the law. The problem here is that it can be inconsistent because it is dependent on the power and initiative of organized groups. And so if now the topic that we all talk about is legalizing uh, illegal drugs, then you'll see a lot more of those, but the attention to that could go away. Other issues and topics come up, and then a group could suggest to withdraw the laws using the same system, using the same information. Um, Again, campaigning to have a vote on striking down the law. And so this is where the inconsistency could come in. Those decisions could relatively easy be flipped. Now, what's really nice about initiatives is that it's an up and down vote. We put the law or the suggested policy on the ballot and people vote yes or no, and that's it. So it is an efficient system. The other way that we see direct democracy examples is through referenda. And here, what happens, the process is a little bit different because the legislator, Parliament, and the Congress in the United States, House of Representatives in different US states, they bring a decision that is already a law or that they already decided it, they bring it to a referenda by the people. So now this is not just an idea that comes from a group of citizens that put it on the ballot, but actual lawmakers deciding on a policy and then bringing it to the people to say if they agree or disagree with it. So here we usually see big items. One of the most notable ones in recent years has been the Brexit referenda in the UK, where lawmakers wanted the UK to leave the European Union, and and they decided on that, but then took it to a vote, to a referendum by the people, and the people in the UK also approved that decision. But if the people would say no, we want to stay in the European Union, then they would have. Other ways that we see referenda coming up is when a group of citizens is really unhappy with a new law and they can start a process that would bring that law to a referenda as well. Decision makers, especially when they make those big item decisions such as Brexit, sometimes they lean on referenda because that would give them the power and the legitimacy to do those big things where otherwise they wouldn't have it. So here are some examples from the 2020 um, elections in the United States. Those are things that were actually on ballots in different states. And because they were on the ballot, there was campaigning by groups who favored those new policies or those who opposed them. And people had the opportunity to vote directly on those decisions, and they either became laws or didn't become laws. So Arizona Proposition 207 was to legalize marijuana, and that passed. And so now it is legal in Arizona. Colorado Proposition 115 was to ban abortions after 22 weeks, but this one failed. So Colorado does not have this kind of policy in place because the people say we don't want it. We have Mississippi measure number 3, which was to approve the state flag, and that passed. So there's different issues here, right? Not just the big ticket items. And then California Proposition 18 is about primary voting for 17 years old, an amendment to that would allow 17 years old to vote in primary voting, but that one failed. These procedural these procedural decisions about election rules and regulations are very, very common, because that has seen something that, people should decide on how we conduct those, how do we conduct elections. And so you do see a lot of those that come up. So that was about direct democracy. However, most of the democratic processes, or most of the governments that have democracies, do not have direct democracy, or they only practice it specific situations, as I explained in the previous slide. Most democracies today are some sort of republics. And that means there is a compromise or a balance between direct democracy and indirect democracy. So usually in some arrangement there is an electoral system and citizens vote to elect their representatives, and then the representatives, our elected officials, are there to make the decisions for the entire populations. So a republic does two things. There is the voice of the people, but it's also a check on the people. So we're not getting into a situation of only majority rule, which would then kind of come to mob rule. A republic allow us to protect the minorities as well as serve the majorities by this balance that we achieve through the elected representatives. And this is how most countries, or most democratic countries, operate now. Something to think about, and this is where, we tend to say that democracy is the best form of government, or the one that's most just. But the democracy also has some drawbacks and some trade-offs. So democracies usually, and we'll talk about it more in the coming days, democracies usually have some sort of a system of checks and balances. Now, that system is important to make sure that no one branch becomes too powerful, that no one person becomes too powerful, that the process and the rule of law are maintained and move us forward. However, that also makes decision making into a slower process because it takes time to clear all those checks and balances. So checks and balances assure slow process. And the idea is that this slow process will give us more time to get educated, to study, to think through all the possible outcomes of the new policy, give us time to hold hearings and debate and amend and change drafts, and to build a compromise. Because usually when there are two sides addressing the same issue, they become polarized or they hold their positions. To build a compromise, it takes a little bit of patience and time and willingness to listen. The democratic process in a republic kind of have this building compromise process built in, but it also means that it takes time. So, because of all of that, democracies could be the best form of government, and they could be very effective, and they could safeguard the rights of minorities while allowing free speech to the majority, and a well thought policies going through all the steps in the process. However, the disadvantage is that democracies are less efficient. They are effective, but they're not efficient. Things take time. And this is why we see that most democracies have some provision that in times of emergency, a lot of those processes are put to hold, and we now value or try to advance efficiency and quickness over the process and thinking things through. So this is how things work in a democracy, in a republic, in an indirect democracy. We vote for representatives, and those representatives then make decisions. There is time to study and learn every topic and situation and proposal and policy, and there is time to make decisions slowly and with this idea of building compromise. So that's the summary of democracies and how they work. We talked a little bit about direct democracy, a little bit more about indirect democracies, and in terms of thinking as we went through the different forms of government and thinking that we like, or some of us could think that they like democracy, I just wanted to make sure we all think and talk about the same type of government.